請勿靠近車門。
請不要靠近車門。
Please stand back from the doors.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. I am your host. My name is Kyle. And for all the new listeners, this is a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. It's a podcast where I interview diaspora Asians about their life stories and experiences. We look to highlight, amplify, and validate Asian voices worldwide. This is a bonus episode. This episode will actually feature me, the host, as I will be putting together several clips of myself being on other people's podcasts. So then you will get to hear more about my story, my experiences, and get to know me a little more as we approach season 3 of our podcast, where I will continue to interview many other interesting diaspora Asians out there. There will be links to those specific podcast episodes in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. And before I get to the episode, make sure you support this podcast by subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platforms, becoming a follower on Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. If you're an Apple listener, make sure you leave a review and rating for the podcast. That will really help the podcast grow. And the podcast will have a YouTube channel now. The YouTube channel is also called What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, which will be the video version of the podcast. And you will get to see everything that goes on with the podcast there. So make sure to subscribe to that channel on YouTube. And now to the episode.
Hi, I'm your host Aaron, and welcome to the First Generations podcast, the show where we dive into the personal experience and knowledge of individuals that pave their path to success on their own terms. From entrepreneurs, professionals, and beyond, we will learn what it takes to walk through their journey and what it means to be first generation. Coming up in this episode.
So I'm trying to figure that out, and I feel like a lot of other diaspora Asians share the same story, and I'm interested in those kind of stories. Thus, I interview a lot of people living life, and also if they have any kind of identity struggles, they talk about it, because I think that helps other people kind of conceptualize their own kind of identity and own place in where they belong.
Welcome to the First Generations podcast. Today's guest is passionate about sharing stories and validating voices of diaspora Asians, aka third culture kids, through his podcast, What Kind of Asian Are You? Through this platform, he explores the views on culture, identity, work, family, inspiration, and many more through the lens of his diaspora Asian guests. Through this exploration, his mission is also to highlight the differences and amplify the perspectives that many in our world may not see or understand as a diaspora. He was born in Hong Kong and raised in Ontario, Canada, and has traveled around Asia teaching English abroad, while familiarizing himself with the unique cultures that the continent has to offer. He currently resides in Singapore, aka a foodie hotspot, enjoying the foods, lifestyle, and culture that is available in the country. I'm honored and proud to present you our podcasting foodie and stand-up inspiration, Kyle Leung. Hi Kyle, how are you doing?
Very good. Very nice introduction.
One of your most recent social media posts mentioned how stuffing your face with delicious food is one of your forms of self-love. Now, what does self-love mean to you? And the reason why I ask this term, because I find that self-love is commonly neglected, whether if it's someone that are in a current relationship or outside of a relationship, or it could be a work relationship or intimate relationship. So what does it mean to you?
That's a very good question. And it's funny that you mentioned that particular post, because I think I didn't really actually think a lot about it actually, and just posted it. But now looking back at it, my idea of self-love would be eating delicious food, because food is something that I'm really passionate about and I like eating. But in terms of the self-love topic, I think for me, because I'm more of an introverted person, for me, self-love would be actually having alone time, being able to do things on my own, work things out, whether it's work related or just personal stuff that I want to do on my own, passion project. I like to have that alone time to be able to be me myself, reflect and stuff. Because I think spending a lot of time with other people for me it's pretty draining at times. I need a lot of time to kind of recharge in a sense if I gone through like a couple of days where it's just constantly personal interaction with many kind of people.
I want to first start off with your journey. Your journey, let's say, from being born in Hong Kong and then being in Markham, Toronto, and going through university and how you ultimately ended up in Singapore. And between that, I believe you traveled around Asia, whether it's Hong Kong, South Korea. You also taught English abroad in Taiwan.
Yes.
First off, was it easy for you to leave so-called, quote-unquote, the nest? And when I say the nest, for our listeners that don't know that reference, it's leaving home.
I would say no, just because of my personality and just how I grew up. It's not like I had a horrible relationship with the family. It's more like with my personality, I try not to hold too much attachment to anything or anyone in particular, just because I guess have more of a Buddhist kind of mindset. I'm not a Buddhist, but anyway, with how the teachings are, I feel like if you have no attachment, then the likelihood of you being bothered by suffering and by pain is to a minimal.
Yes.
Because with the whole Buddhist thing is, attachment leads to pain and suffering. So with that being said, I never had huge attachment to really any single thing or people in a great extent where it affects me.
Okay.
Of course, I do care about family and stuff, and occasionally I do miss stuff, but my level isn't as high where I wouldn't make a big move like moving to another place. If that makes sense. I would say the decision wasn't hard just because I see what I wanted and what works best for me. And at that point in my life, when it was like where I decided to move to another country to start a new kind of chapter in my life, it was more out of the fact that I see what my current situation was at that point and felt like I wanted to make a move and do something different.
That totally makes sense. The way I interpret it too is with that mindset, you're living in the present. And I think one very important thing that doesn't get talked about, and this was a nugget dropped to me by one of my family members. And what I was told was nothing in the world lasts forever, or nothing in the world belongs to you forever. I prefer that saying, nothing in the world lasts forever, because it goes on with attachment. It's recognizing the present moment, being grateful for what's going on at the present moment, but not expecting, there's no expectations. But again, it's ridding of that attachment. And do you think this has a big impact, or do you think this kind of stems from your personality too as an introvert?
I think to a certain extent, because it's just how it happened that I'm introverted and I'm used to doing things on my own, or I'm pretty independent by nature.
Yes.
That leaving and starting somewhere else by myself isn't really that daunting. So when I decided to just move away from home and start a new chapter, it was just like, oh, it's a new chapter and I'll just live in the present and just go with it. I don't think I had much qualms about leaving at all.
Okay.
Obviously, it would suck. Oh, I'm not with family anymore, but I feel like it's just part of life. Nothing really should matter that much if you're making the best choice at that moment.
Yes.
And I felt I made the best choice at that moment that I was presented with.
To add on that too, because I feel very similar. I feel that both you and I have a very similar mentality in terms of that aspect. Again, not clinging to life. And in the case, like some people may ask, or like our guests may ask, or our listeners may ask, what about your family? What if something happens to your family? Well, how do you spend more time with your family? You're so far away. But I look at it as, we have technologies right now that can connect us to our family, right? It's like we can make time. We can prioritize that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because we're doing things our own way doesn't mean we don't prioritize it. It's just that it just so happens that, hey, we just figure things out to make it happen.
Yeah, and you mentioning that now, just suddenly thought of something where it's like, well, for me, my family immigrated and they left some family behind in Hong Kong. So they understand if you got to move somewhere else, you got to move somewhere else. And yeah, it sucks, but you do what you need to do. And if you can go back to visit or vice versa, you can do so. And that's fine. Like, I think for me, at least how I think is like they understand that concept. So it's not where they never had that experience of having to leave a place, leaving people behind.
Okay. Now, I want to go into the profession of teaching English. You taught English abroad, and I believe in Taiwan. So how did you come across or get into or be exposed to this opportunity?
I would say it stemmed from when I had the opportunity before I left for Taiwan to travel to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan.
Okay.
There was 3 weeks where I just traveled to those places one year, and the people I met there, some are just normal tourists as well, and others are just random me. And we just talk about how, it's so nice to be traveling in like Asia, and also like the opportunity to just live in Asia is very attractive, and there are different ways to do so. And at that point, people are always putting thoughts in my head of, you could always consider like moving to Asia and just teaching English, because the market's there and they needed people, and you could make a decent living doing that, and you could still to have time to explore and all that stuff. So eventually, I think that idea really got stuck into my head, and at that point, I was also at a crossroad deciding what's my next move in terms of life in Canada, because I think I graduated maybe at that point close to maybe a year already.
Okay.
And I was figuring out, do I really want to continue what I'm doing, or do I want to continue in the rat's race per se, in terms of like trying to keep moving up and do that job, that grind, and then hopefully eventually be able to buy property on that stuff.
Yeah.
And at that point, I felt I could do that and work really hard to get to that point where I could afford my own place and all that stuff. But is that really what I wanted to do? Because I don't have, like I said, in terms of attachment, I don't have that huge attachment to things.
Yes.
So I thought, yes, property is nice, but would it fulfill me? I didn't feel that. And I felt I really want to explore Asia as well, because I felt that I lost a bit of myself in terms of identity and knowing who I am by not being Asia, because I was born there. But now I was raised in Canada, where I'm kind of not like fully attached to back to Asia. So I want to kind of explore that roots a little more. So thus I decided, let's take the road of teaching English and see how I could live in Asia and also explore that.
So you mentioned earlier on with your identity, you had this identity that gave you that inner drive to go visit Asia, go travel there. And you just happen to be the founder and host of the What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. So the podcast is an inspiration, using this platform to share stories of diaspora Asians. Now, did you feel that this tied in with your identity as well, or that identity period of yourself back when you were traveling in Asia?
I would say for sure, actually, because I think my identity plays a huge part of what I decided to pursue in terms of the podcast topic I have of Asian and our Asian identity, especially diaspora Asian identity, because I think that's what I relate to the most. That being said, I think why I'm so attached to this concept or topic that I'm talking about on my podcast is because of the fact that I'm still interested, or I'm still really searching for my own identity of who I am and what kind of person I am within my Asian and also kind of Canadian lens. Because I feel like I didn't spend that much time really thinking about that kind of thing growing up. Yeah. It's only till later when I realized, I want to know more about that, because I feel kind of lost of why do I think of certain things and how I feel about it is this way, but seems like normal people or people that are my peers that should have similar experiences and also thoughts think differently. Oh. So that's where the question comes up, where it's like, why am I thinking like that? Or like, why do I feel this way? And then it all kind of leads back to because of my unique kind of perspective of things, because of the fact that I was born in Hong Kong and then moved to Canada as a young person and then grew up there. But then I still, at the same time, I have some cultural roots still left behind in Hong Kong that I do take on.
Yes.
But then not to the full extent where it's 50-50 or any good proportion of balance. So I'm trying to figure that out. And I feel like a lot of other diaspora Asians share the same story. And I'm interested in those kind of stories. Thus, I interview a lot of people living life. And also if they have any kind of identity struggles, they talk about it, because I think that helps other people kind of conceptualize their own kind of identity and own like place and where they belong.
And I guess for you with your identity, I can even, you brought this up and it really, it's very interesting. When you brought it up, it kind of made me think about it too. With you, your form of traveling, your form of settling in, going to Taiwan, teaching English in Taiwan, and being now in Singapore is your way of trying to move towards the path of that self-identity. I think for me, I haven't gone further up the ladder for that step yet. But yeah, it's definitely one thing I've been looking forward to.
Yeah, but I think you don't need to be too hard on yourself on that, because I think everyone has their different journey towards figuring out who they are and what their identity is. I think if you have that mindset of, I want to look deeper into that, and that's good enough already. I don't think you should really take it as there's a deadline for when you start doing that.
Yeah.
And no, everyone have a different kind of story, different path. With more people that I interview on my podcast, I'm realizing everyone have different lives, and as long as they live their best way and they're happy, they're fulfilled, it doesn't matter whether or not they reach a certain level of actualization of what it means to be Asian or what it means to be Asian in the diaspora.
And Kyle, I want to thank you so much for coming on to our show.
It's all good. I had a blast, and I'm very grateful and also appreciative of the fact that you're allowing me to be on your platform, sharing my story, and just having a good chat with you.
Hope you enjoyed the show. You can follow us on Instagram and subscribe to us on YouTube at First Generations Podcast. For any questions, comments, and inquiries, please reach out to Aaron at firstgenerationspodcast.com. That is AARON at firstgenerationspodcast.com.
What kind of Asian are you? Well, what kind of Asian are you, motherfucker? Pardon my Cantonese. What kind of Chinese are you, Can you use chopsticks and do karate? Shit. What? What kind of Asian am I? I'm Korean American. I'm an Asian American immigrant. I'm Asian diaspora. And chances are, if you're listening to this, you might be too. Or you might be a cheeky halfie, a cheeky happa, or some other form of third culture kid. Or you might not be any of these, but you're just interested in hearing a different perspective. So today we have a fucking awesome guest, and I'm super fucking pumped for this episode. We have Kyle Leung. He's the host of the podcast, What Kind of Asian Are You? He's Hong Kong-born Canadian and talks with Asian diaspora from all over the world about their experiences, sharing their stories and amplifying their perspectives. And we talk a lot of Asian diaspora stuff, as you might imagine, what it's like growing up as Asian immigrants in North America, coming back to Asia, and pursuing meaning in our identity, our heritage, our lives, and becoming better versions of ourselves. We talk about how being Asian diaspora means being forced to pick a side and the confusion that follows, the variety of the Asian diaspora experience, and getting in touch with our roots. Not taking things personally when people try to put us in a box. Accepting ourselves for who we are and being happy with being in the middle. Becoming happy with being you and not wanting to be someone else, another ethnicity. Wanting to communicate and connect better with our parents to have more honest, open, loving relationships. Whether or not it's important to connect to one's own heritage or mother tongue and the benefits of doing so. How having these conversations and coming to understand and appreciate our identity can empower us to become better people, and so much more. If you're Korean American like me, or Canadian born Chinese, or Chinese French, or Japanese Brazilian, whatever you may be, then you got to check out his podcast. If you're Asian diaspora, you got to check out the What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. I was so excited to talk with Kyle that I think I talked too much. And there were a bunch of questions that I didn't get to ask him. So I definitely want him on the show again. And I wish I had his podcast when I was a kid, because I felt like it could have helped me with so many of the problems and the issues with identity struggle that I grew up with. So if you relate at all, please give this episode a listen, and please go check out his podcast. If you got anything out of this episode, and you know someone who's curious about getting in touch with their roots or going through some identity struggle issues, being a third culture kid or Asian diaspora or whatever you want to call it, then please share it with them. It might help them out. I wish someone had shared these kinds of conversations with me, but I didn't have the internet growing up, or even if there were resources and people having these conversations, I just didn't have access to it. So you might be doing someone a huge favor if they're willing and ready to listen to these kinds of conversations. So please leave a 5-star rating if you enjoyed the episode, and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get it hard. You know what time it is? It's Maim time. Kyle. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. It's nice to be able to hop on this chat with you and learn from you, make a new friend. I mean, we are recently acquainted, so it's exciting to learn from each other and become quick friends through recording a podcast.
This is great. Like, I'm really excited. Oh, by the way, welcome Maim timers, Maim time listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Yeah, we have Kyle Leung, and I came across this podcast last week, actually, and it's called What Kind of Asian Are You? What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. And then when I found that podcast, I was like, what kind of Asian am I? This is a question I've had since I was a kid, actually, which is funny enough. But Kyle, can you please tell us about yourself? Tell us what's your podcast all about?
Hello, listeners. So again, my name is Kyle. I'm the host of What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Asian diaspora or Asian people as a whole, because I want to highlight, amplify, and validate their voices during a time when I feel mainstream media in the West not really caring about Asian diaspora stories as a whole. And, to be frank, Asians as a whole don't really care about Asian diaspora stories either, because they don't feel like, they need to, because they have their own kind of stories and experiences. So I want to use my podcast to give a platform to those that, should have their voices heard. And I've been doing it for close to a year, interviewing people from from all facts of life, from singers, dancers, comedians, YouTubers, content creators, and business people, everyone that, you can think of that you might be interested in or you can relate to, at least I hope. A little bit about me. I am from Hong Kong originally. I was born there, and then I immigrated to Canada with a family when I was about 5, and I lived there since. But now I'm in Singapore after about 3 years in Taiwan teaching English, and now I'm here in Singapore with my wife, who's a Singaporean.
That's awesome. For first-time listeners, if you don't know my backstory, I was born in Korea, but my family moved to America when I was 1, and so I didn't keep any of the language. Maybe like when I was 2 or 3, maybe I spoke a little bit, but otherwise, like, I'm pretty whitewashed. And I grew up in America my whole life, not learning Korean, not being really in touch with my roots. Even though I grew up in a Korean family, in a Korean household, I went to school and I was a lot of times the only Asian kid in my class, or like in my homeroom class. And so there's pictures of me, in a sea of white kids or some black kids or Hispanic, and like it's just me being the only Asian. So I grew up in different parts of the States. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. And then I came back to Korea in 2012, about 9 years ago. And I came back to Korea to find my roots and, try to find some work. And that was also like English tutoring. And I'm still here in Korea. And in that time, I've had many amazing travels and adventures and wonderful chats. And I'm really happy to be here with Kyle, sharing our experiences together. And Kyle, I just want to say that your podcast is the fucking shit. Like, this shit that we talk about, that you talk about, is so important. I mean, in one way, like, damn, I should have just named my shit What Kind of Asian Are You? Damn, he stole my idea. No, I think the brands and the message and what you're doing to amplify the diaspora voices, man, this is perfect. Like, this is the shit that I needed, Kyle. Where were you? God damn it. Where were you when I was 15, confused with my identity, and I didn't have anybody to connect with this? Where were you? This is all your fault, Kyle, for not,
I'm sorry, but when you were 15, I was around the same age too. And I was also trying to figure out my identity as well. So I can help you before helping myself. And I feel like even though I'm doing this podcast where I'm asking a lot of diaspora about their life and their experience, I still haven't really completely figured it out. And I don't think my guests have either. And I think it's a lifelong journey, and we should be okay with that. We should appreciate that, we're constantly looking for answers and figuring out our way and figuring out how to accept our dual identities.
But see, that's the perfect thing to say. And it's actually not that complicated, that attitude. It's just like, you know what? It's a lifelong journey. And just to accept it and just to be cool with it. I want to delve deep into this shit with you. I mean, hard. I want to get into it with you hard. We have so
I'm
much
ready.
to talk
Let's
about.
go.
But,
Let's do this.
bro, like, what does it mean to be Asian diaspora or immigrant for you? What's the significance of it to you? And how are we different from Asians who grew up in Asia? Right? Listeners may already get this. Sorry, it might be obvious, but what from your perspective, I want to hear it.
That's a really good question. And honestly, I think I have this kind of discussion with other people a lot, very often as well. And just a question that I have in my mind often. And to be honest, I think for me, the difference, or at least what makes Asian diaspora different from just, Asians in Asia, is that we are put in the position where we're forced, in a sense, to pick a side. We are forced to either be very Western or very Asian, meaning that you are supposed to have only one singular identity, or that you can assimilate to either sides. And I think it's tough when you still have your parental influences that are from the East that, they might not completely assimilate to Western culture. So they still have a huge Eastern kind of mindset that they will instill in you. But at the same time, in your everyday schooling and your interaction with other people that's not Eastern minded, you'll have that Western influences put into you too. And when those two put together, you're now becoming something that's realistically a mixture of everything. And when you become a mixture of everything, you're not one single thing. But with how the world is set up, they prefer you to be one singular thing. I don't know if you agree with that, but like they find it easier to be able to like put you in a box. Oh, you're white, you're Asian, you're blah blah. And if you're like a mix of everything, they don't know how to really put you as a person. Or like they think, then what are you? Are you with us? Are you with them? Like the constant kind of, what team are you in? I think that's the biggest thing I see. And to be honest, you're not able to fit in anywhere as, Asian diaspora, because you got everything, but you're not having the complete kind of thing, because you're not going to be able to completely be well versed in what's happening in Asia. But at the same time, when you're in the West, you're not exactly able to know all the cultural kind of nuances that, other people in the Western society have, because you also have that Eastern influence. Do you relate to that part too, or do you see it differently?
Well, obviously 100%. Yeah, that's a really good description, I think, of the Asian diaspora experience, that we're not completely in one or the other. And so people want to put you in the box. And here's something that I want to talk about on my podcast, which is that I've come to a point in my life where I've learned to accept that that's just human. It's not like a great moral evil or an injustice upon people. And I might trigger Asian diaspora by saying this, but people put you in a box, and I put people in boxes. I have my whole life, and we all do. When we try to identify people and we put people in boxes, do we do it in the most gentlemanly, lady, compassionate, understanding way? Maybe a lot of times, no. But it's a human thing that people want to categorize other people, and that people wanted to categorize me because they're trying to figure out who I am. And it wasn't necessarily an aggressive thing or a microaggression or something like that. That's how I look at it now. It's just human, because for, however many tens of thousands of years, we grew up in distinct geographical locations with distinct languages, and our whole lives, our ancestors' lives, our grandparents' lives or whatever, they only lived within, the same ethnicity, and everyone spoke the same language and looked pretty similarly. Like, I think this is a general pattern throughout all societies that, hey, everyone, if you live in a certain area, a lot of people generally look the same, speak the same. They have this similarity, and they have similar culture within the same tribe. And so when there's a new variable, then people are like, well, what is that? That thing doesn't look like us. That animal doesn't look like us animals. So, what's that all about? It's pattern recognition. And so I want to tell people, like, it's if you have trauma like I do of being put in a box, for me, I've come to a point where I just accept it. It's not because it doesn't help me to get triggered every single time someone puts me in a box and ready for it. And that's also possibly true. Is there anything you'd like to say to maybe younger listeners out there? You don't have to be young, or anyone out there who's going through maybe issues with their Asian diaspora identity, trying to figure themselves out. Like if you could talk to your 15-year-old self, what would you say?
I would say don't rush it because with time comes the ability to process things at a different rate. You figuring out stuff at 15 doesn't mean it's perfect because that's just your 15-year-old brain at work. Who knows if you figure it out when you're 20, when you're 25, when you're 30, and so on and so forth, that those kind of realization will hit you even better, or like it will inspire you even more. That said, I think, again, don't rush it. Everyone has their own kind of trajectory, their own journey. And what you just got to do is just focus on yourself, focus on just being a better person at that point. And if that means you have to not worry too much about your identity at that point, that's fine. You can come back to it. It's not like you'll never get back into figuring out what your identity is, because it will follow you for the rest of your life, because identity is such a big part of who you are. It's ingrained in you. Like you want to know who you are, regardless of you're like 5, 10, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years old. You'll always be curious as who you truly are. And if it means you finding out at age 99 and you die when you're 100, at least, you live a life trying to figure it out. And that's worthy already. You don't need to figure things out right away. No one figures it out right away. For everything in life, people are always trying to find out the best answer, the best solution. And it doesn't always come to you when you want it. It comes to you when you're ready, when you need it. And yeah, I think everyone has their own timing, and put less emphasis on figure things out and just focus more on just being a good person. Because I think being a good person will lead you to good things, but good things will lead to, you figuring things out. Because I think good things always brings out good feelings and good results regardless. So if you do good things now, maybe later on, then good things like finding out what you're truly about will come out because of the fact you did good things beforehand.
Damn, that's so great. That's fucking perfect answer. And I wish I heard that when I was 15. Yeah. Take your time. You don't have to rush things. You can come back to these issues later. And in the meantime, be a good person, because good things come to good people.
And for those who's interested in checking out my podcast is What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. And I interview Asian diaspora on their life stories and experience. And I just want to make sure that everyone gets a platform to share their voice, their creations, their life, their stories. And in the process, hopefully help those that are feeling lonely being Asian diaspora be less lonely, and for them to know that they're not alone, and they got a support network if they seek out for it. And find the podcast on all major digital platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, all that stuff. And if you want to follow the socials, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. And I appreciate people, DMing me if they find something that they relate to and they just want to chat about, the Asian diaspora experience, or just have any questions about, just living Asian diaspora life. Because I think I want to be that person to help those that are confused or just want someone to talk to. So reach out, What Kind of Asian Pod. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak on things I really care about and love talking about.
Kyle, I can't thank you enough for doing what you do for your podcast and coming on to the show. It really means a lot to me. I think this is one of the best conversations on Maim Time so far, really. Everyone, my Asian brothers and sisters, and my diaspora third culture kids, please go check out Kyle's podcast and subscribe. I'm sure you'll find something related. Like, I'm going to go through a bunch of them. And it's kind of sorry. Like I wish I asked you, what your favorite episodes were. But also check out First Generations podcast, the interview that
Yes.
that Kyle has there.
Shout out to Aaron.
Yeah, shout out to Aaron. I'm gonna meet you soon. Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Mime Time. This has been fire, and I really appreciate it. And again, if any of this resonates with you, please share it with a friend and reach out to me or reach out to Kyle. Have a great week. Please tune in next time. All right, peace. Oh.
All right, welcome back to the podcast, guys. This is episode 13. I have a fellow and experienced podcast veteran, if you will, to make this podcast from good to mediocre to awesome. He's a host of the What Kind of Asian Are You and Never Jaded podcast. Kyle Leung, thank you very much for coming on and especially being so flexible with the time difference.
No, I appreciate being asked to come on your podcast. It's an honor, and really happy that you reached out. It's always nice to have another podcaster be like, "Oh, I want you to be on the podcast talking about your stories and your experience," because I'm used to being the one that's asking people to come on to share their stories and hoping that they will be like, "Oh yeah, I want to do it." So this time having you ask is nice. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And especially an honor for me too, because you do such a great job with the podcast you are hosting. So can you give me a brief summary, if you will, of both the podcast you're doing and kind of your goals there?
For sure. So first off, my main podcast, or I guess the first podcast that I started, would be What Kind of Asian Are You podcast? A podcast just featuring conversations about being Asian. But that said, it literally is where I would interview mainly people with interesting stories, backgrounds, and if they have anything they want to share, whether it's their creativity, their business ideas, or anything that they do, I'll have them on. And the people that I bring on are usually of Asian background, mostly from the West, in terms of like, oh, they were born there or they immigrated there, or just their background is in Asia, but then they spent their lives, or their family spent their lives in the West. And the reason I just started it because I was bored during pandemic 2020, like a lot of people, and I want to be creative. And I realized I wasn't really creative in terms of like what I could do, like artistically, musically, and anything like that. Like I can't draw, I can't sing or anything like that. But like I became a big fan of podcasting maybe since 2013, 2014. I've just been an avid listener. And then I think by 2020, it would be like 8 years where I thought, oh, I could do this podcasting thing where I just talk to people. And I was like, oh, and I actually do want to be more creative in my own life, just to have like another hobby or whatnot. So I decided podcasting would be the greatest kind of medium for me to spread my creativity. And that's how I decided, oh, I'm going to do a podcast. And in terms of why I decided to do a podcast specifically where I interviewed Asians, of their stories and all that stuff, it's just because I find that with mainstream media, or especially in the like at least Western podcast space, not a lot of podcasts focuses on like Asian stories, specifically those that are third culture kids, meaning they have the mixture of like Western influences and also Eastern influences. So I want to like just talk more about that topic and just interview people of that background, because I think we need to be more represented. And I think podcasting is such a great place for anyone without any barriers to kind of share their stories. So that's what I've been doing for close to a year now. And I also have another podcast, like you mentioned, called Never Jaded. It's a podcast that I do with my buddy Robin. We are trying to do this podcast just because we enjoy just hanging out, talking to each other. Right. And we are really passionate about like media, specifically like representation in the like Asians and all that stuff. And we just want to have a podcast where we can just talk to people that are Asian creators and giving them their flowers, like complimenting them, praising them for what they do, what cool stuff they've been doing. And we like to usually find those that are like, either starting out or like we believe that they have huge potential to like break out in whatever field they're in.
Yeah.
And so far, we've been interviewing people like artists, like actors, dancers, DJs, art, anything really, anything creative. We just want to like give them their flowers and like keep it positive and make sure that people see these hidden gems per se. So that's what I do in terms of podcast front.
That's so awesome. And I love what you do for, I mean, your motive is to really promote the Asian representation and just kind of talk about the stories. I'm sure that we'll kind of do a little deep dive on your story as well. And so being such a big fan of what kind of Asian are you podcast, because when I was younger and kind of going through my struggles as well, when I came over here when I was young and just seeing a bunch of white people and nothing around me that looked similar, I definitely kind of went through my struggles. I'm like, okay, who am I? What am I? So it's great to listen to your podcast episodes to be able to relate and kind of go through, kind of peel back the emotions that I went through when I was younger. But yeah, I kind of want to turn the table on you a little bit. And as the host of What Kind of Asian Are You, you ask people questions about their childhood. So instead, I want to ask you questions about your childhood. So doing my basic investigation research, you know, I know that you were born in Hong Kong and you moved over to Canada at 4, and you spent majority of your childhood, maybe a little bit earlier into your adulthood in Canada. So can you kind of talk about, you know, being Asian in a different country, in this case is Canada, and kind of your childhood growing up, some of the experiences you went through and things like that?
For sure. It's interesting in the aspect that I don't feel like I had like, I guess, the stereotypical Asian American experience in terms of parents moving to the West and they decided to set up their family in the middle of nowhere in America, like the Midwest or anything, any rural area where they're the only Asian. I did not have that. Maybe it's because I immigrated with my family in the mid to late 90s, where immigration patterns, at least to Canada, it wasn't really where people from Asia had no choice and they had to immigrate just to like middle of nowhere. They were able to immigrate to the big cities because I'm sure even with America, a lot of time you might want to just move to San Francisco or New York, those big cities. But sometimes it might not be the case because, you know, just how immigration laws and all that stuff or the abilities to. But for my family, we were lucky. We were able to go to the East Coast, specifically near the Toronto area. And for that part, we lived in the part of the city where, you know, it's majority Asian, specifically Chinese dominated. So for most of my life, I never felt like out of place in the stereotypical regard of a lot of like mainstream Asian American stories where I was the only white kid. I was the only person in a white place. Yeah. Like, I don't know if you have that experience yourself, but for me, I was literally where it was really crazy to the point where if I look at my high school, you know, that graduation book with everyone's headshots.
Yeah.
And that, and for a little context, the school that I graduated from, I was in the first graduating class. It was a brand new school. So it was a new era. But then of like the 100 people or so in that graduating class, I think at least 97% was Asian people.
Really?
Yes. Where it was majority like Chinese or East Asian or Indian. Like, if anything, we could easily point out all the white people or the black people. Like, if you were like trying to find a specific Asian person, you would have to look. But if you were like, oh, we want to find John Smith, that one John Smith in the graduating class, we could literally point at it right away.
Wow.
So that's quite unique, I would say. Like, and I didn't really realize how unique it was until later on, as I like think back, like, wow, I knew I always lived in a more kind of Asian dominated area, but I wasn't really thinking about how crazy to have a school where most of us were like of Asian background, until I went to university, where I went to like more of a rural area for university, and there I became the minority again. Yeah, in a sense where everyone was kind of more white people or like other ethnicity, but like Asian wasn't like, oh, where I was like, oh, it's normal to see an Asian. It wasn't to that point where it's like I was the only one, but it was like we were lower numbers.
Yeah.
I think that's when I realized, oh, it's really, really different. And it's not that I didn't feel like didn't fit in. It's just I feel out of place though for some reason. Maybe it's just myself, not necessarily what they did to me. Because I think for most part in my childhood, even in my like university days, I didn't feel like I was really uh looked looked down upon on or anything like that, or like I felt where they gave me the side eye or anything like that. It was pleasant, but then I still felt something was off.
Mm.
So that's my general kind of childhood or like my experience growing up in Canada, being from Hong Kong, being an immigrant and all that stuff.
So that's interesting. I had never heard of someone immigrating to a different country and still being in a high school where it's predominantly all Asian, whether it's, Asian or Chinese, Korean, what have you, but predominantly Asian population, and then having minorities be whether the blacks, the whites, what have, other races. So that's interesting. So how was your high school experience if your predominantly was Asian? I'm sure it's very competitive, very, very smart. But how was your experience? Because I feel like my experience is completely different. I'm sure that normal story, like you talked about, was very different, right? When you migrate over there to a different country, you're the majority, more likely going to be the minority. But in this case, it was quite the different or the opposite.
I think, especially for a high school, I feel like what I've noticed that now stood out to me was like, oh, us kind of like being more like okay or like more into, I guess, specific Asian culture or Asian pop culture wasn't that like shunned upon on, or like we were able to do so along with being like appreciative of like, oh, current popular culture in the West. Like we were able to be like, oh, we like what's on MTV, but also we could be like into K-drama or K-pop, that kind of stuff where people either liked it or not, but that they didn't hate on it or anything, that just because it was Asian.
Yeah.
I think that's the big difference. Like they might have like say, oh, I don't like this, I prefer Western media, but that's fine. It's not because it was Asian. It was just, it's not their cup of tea.
Yeah.
But I guess for a lot of other people, let's just say in the place where it's all white people, they might be like, oh, ew, K-pop or whatever, just because it's not white, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest difference. Like we were able to like what we liked in terms of Asian culture stuff and also Western culture. Like there wasn't really a point in my time where it's like I felt I had to pick either or.
Right. So that's very interesting because I do feel like a lot of people have experienced that. Like you talked about, oh, you can't kind of bring up like K-drama or anime or things like, Asian people might be really interested in, but there's not, maybe there's not a club for that, or there's not a big interest there because the majority are whites or blacks or different cultures that really aren't into that and might look down upon it. So to transition from that kind of environment to college where it was completely different, right? Now you're kind of maybe the minority. So how was that adjustment period? Was it easy? Was it difficult? What was the experience like?
Honestly, I didn't feel like it was that bad at all, actually, because I think even though I might not be like the ethnicity that's the majority in my college, but at the same time, I think given that at least with most of the demographic of those people that are there, a lot of them are coming in from being from the city, so that we can bond through like, oh yeah, we're coming to this place where it's a little more rural than normal, so it's like we can bond over that. And I think maybe it was me being not that observant, but I don't think race or like my culture or anything like that was really something that they pinpointed at specifically, or like it wasn't, or at least I wasn't involved in those conversations, so obviously. But I didn't feel like, no, I had to explain myself or like I had to like be different. Like I were able to find like a close knit people, a group of people that were of the same ethnicity or like same cultural background as me, and I hung out with them. But also had people that are in my classes that I could still hang out with and like no played and all that stuff, and there was no problem. And we were just Canadians, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. Like I want to be like, oh, give you a story of like, oh yeah, I had a lot of racist stuff, but that's not my story, right? But then I feel like that's always the narrative in mainstream media when it comes to Asian American experiences.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's not valid, but I think there's the scope is bigger, or like there's a lot of actually like Asian bubbles or Asian enclaves in America as well that they don't really talk about, but it's there.
Yeah.
So I just want to, at least with my own podcast, where I highlight that Asian story. It could be very, very like every types of Asians that you have, they all have different stories, and I want to show or highlight them as well.
So that's awesome, man. I love that because I'm 100% for that too. Like, let's not talk about like whether you're black, Asian, or different. Someone that had this against me. No, like it was experience where I felt like I was American or Canadian or just I was that citizen. Like I just felt like a part of the community. I think that's a beautiful thing. Like that's just because you didn't see the race. You just felt like you accumulated to the community very well, and you felt maybe not at home, but you just felt like you're one of the people that you're going with, and you didn't feel like isolated or anything like that. At least for me, I feel like that's something that could be highlighted. It's not always, you're getting, judged or racism and, they're making signs at you or things like that. But I think there are stories like that out there that could be highlighted as well.
Yeah, I think just for my personal experience, like whatever identity or cultural stuff that I had to deal with, a lot of it is just me putting it on myself just because of like being young, not knowing what I truly am, because I'm trying to acclimate to where I have Western culture being taught to me in school, but at home, my immigrant parents, they're still very Eastern. So therefore, I have two different influences. And I think back then, I didn't know that, oh, you're able to mix them together and it's fine. I think before, it was always where I thought I need to be very much one thing or the other.
Yeah.
Or else, like, I'm not really anything.
Yeah.
But I think as I got older, I came to this realization that it's okay to be mixed of whatever it is that you have. As long as you is authentic, is real, and is honest, it doesn't matter. You just take what's best from both ends and make it your own.
That's so I love that you bring that up because I always struggle to bring that, like, try to piece that together. But I also want to ask you, what form do you think, because when you're a child, it's your brain's so malleable, you learn different things and you don't know what is what, and you feel like you have to kind of attach yourself to one thing and just be part of that community. And because when you're so young, you want to be like you. When you get older, you feel like, you can let that go. It's not a big deal. But when you're young, you're so associated with being liked and having a bunch of friends and different things like that. What part of that do you think associates with like adjusting well to maybe a minority group, high school setting, or different things like that?
I honestly thought about that often, and I still don't really have an answer because I feel like it's really hard, especially when you talk about like how it starts from young, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of stuff, it just happens that way, and you have no kind of explanation for it. You might find some clarity if you go through therapy or whatever that they're trying to understand more your like makeup and all that stuff. But I think at the end of the day, sometimes you might have to deal with the fact that you don't know all the answers, but that's okay. You just have to go with what you have, what information you do have, and work with that, and like try to work with what you know how to handle. And it's not easy to get to this point, and I'm not saying I'm completely there yet, but I think we should strive to get to the point where it's where we can think about it, but it doesn't affect us to a point where it paralyzes us into like not doing something or doing something that might be hurting us.
I agree. And also, maybe we should, instead of looking at it like what my identity is as a race, let's look at identity of who I am. Like whoever, like Dahan or whoever Kyle is, like individually, because what you highlighted, like, you're gonna, as you grow, you're gonna find about yourself. Maybe that's just part of growing up. You don't know who you are. Of course, you don't know. You're 18. You're just going through the every day to day to Monday to Friday. You go to school, and then on the weekends, you maybe play outside a little bit. You don't have the experiences to really let you know who you are until as you get older. And I think that's the beauty about growing older, right? You grow and have experiences to let you know who you are, who you're not, and how you get better in different things. So, like for you, I don't have the answer to what that may be. Maybe it's therapy, maybe it's some sort of program that someone comes up with in the future. But I think it's okay to feel like you don't have an identity because maybe that's just being part of being young. Maybe that is it. And maybe you should enjoy being young and being a kid and going to school and enjoy that experience and know that you're not going to find the answers. Shoot, I don't have the answers. Maybe some people in their 50s don't have the answers,
Yeah. And it's just something I recently thought of, like with like the whole Olympics going on and all that stuff. Is like, in terms of our identity, I think one of the easier ways to kind of figure out, what my identity is attaching yourself to terms of your nationality and like where you're from or where you were born and all that stuff. But I now kind of find that could be potentially problematic in terms of you putting all your identity, like what you consider your identity, into like, you're national. I'm American. I support all things American. All like that kind of mindset. But then upon further think about it, that's very nationalist kind of nationalism and being patriotic, which I think certain degree, of course, you need to be like that. But I think when you're at a loss of like who you truly are in terms of your identity, you might take it overboard where those kind of nationalistic ideas or being patriotic could lead you to like really extreme kind of thinking of like what kind of life you should lead and how you treat others and all that stuff. But yeah, I haven't really figured out like what's the best way to like figure out your identity. I don't think anyone knows. And I think it's different for everyone as well. Like some people, their identity is fixed on a particular thing that they like or a thing that they truly believe in or like they grew up with. But for other, it could be entirely different.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point you bring up as well, right? Like the Olympics, like a good competitive edge is great, right? We're being competitive with the sports and things like that, but being so rooted into maybe your country or things like that, that could, go down wrong line or, have blurred lines or negative things that can come with it. Maybe I don't have the answer, but maybe the answer is that we don't know. It's okay that we don't know. Maybe that may be the answer. Like you're going to find out as you go through life and experiences. Because how could you possibly expect someone who is young as 16, 17, 18 when they're still shifting? And we're still, I know we're in the kind of late 20s, we're still shifting, learning. And that's kind of maybe a reason why we do the podcast. We want to talk to people and grow our insight into life, into who we are. So you can't really expect to have your everything figured out 17, 18 and really know who your identity is because shoot, people in their 50s don't know. So but yeah, I mean, I really like the discussion we're having there. Obviously, there is no answer, but maybe that's the beautiful thing. There is no answer to it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you don't need people to tell you the answer. It's just you hearing people work through their kind of like, issues or like just how they see things could help you already. Like they don't need to give you the answer. They just have to show you like their process of thinking. I think that also will lead you to thinking more about your own process of how you identify, how you differentiate, and how you figure out different things. So yeah, you don't need to. No, we're not supposed to tell you the answer of like really deep things relating to yourself because we don't know your lives. We just know what works for us. So whatever we say here, it might not actually be the answer for you, but it could help you in some weird random way that we could not tell you right now, but it might help you. But hopefully it helps.
But that is it for episode 13. Thank you very much, everybody.